The art in fly fishing is to present our fly in a place where we think it's likely to attract a fish. And the fly rod is designed to do just that, to act as a spring that propels our line in the direction we want it to go. So, good casting is fundamental to successful fly fishing. Now, it's a fact that most anglers start by learning the overhead cast, and almost invariably that is what they use for nearly all their fly fishing. So, you might think that in a program about fly casting I'd concentrate on the overhead cast. Well, I'm not going to, because in my view there's a much better way of presenting a fly. Spey casting. Judging by what's been written about it, you might think that spey casting is very difficult for the average angler to master. An arcane rite, denied to all except a few gifted performers and taking years to learn. Well, this is all nonsense. With good instruction, you can master it in a weekend. In salmon fishing in particular, the spey cast is indispensable. It's very seldom that we need to overhead cast or should overhead cast. And the angler unable to spey cast can never realize anything like his full potential. Now, there are 5 reasons for this. First of all, obstruction. We're quite often on the river bank with a high cliff behind us, a wooded slope, bushes, mounds of rocks, where overhead casting is very difficult, if not impossible. And we have to spey cast. Now, secondly, there's this question of safety, personal safety. All too often, an overhead cast, faultily executed, will bring that fly whistling back far too low. And I can assure you that the big treble of a 3-inch tube fly buried in the back of your skull is no joke. Now, thirdly, there's the safety of the fly itself. When we're spey casting, the hook never comes anywhere near the river bank. It's always out in the water. We can see that it's safe. And we're not going to lose a fish because of a broken hook. Now, this happens frequently when we're overhead casting. A freak of wind will dip the leader behind us and flick the fly against a rock. We don't feel it, we don't know what's happened, we fish on down the pool with a broken hook and perhaps lose our only chance of the day, perhaps of a week. And the salmon is a difficult enough fish to catch, and in short enough supply these days, we don't want to miss a chance because of something as silly as that. But it happens all too frequently. And I suppose that a broken hook is probably the most common reason of losing salmon. Now, fourthly, there is false casting. You see, in spey casting, we can make a big change of angle in one cast. We don't have to flick our fly to and fro across the water and have that line flashing across over the lies. Now, this can be very disturbing to salmon. I know because I've seen it. If we're spey casting, we avoid false casting. And lastly, there's the wind. Now, a bitter wind, a gusty wind blowing up or downstream can be the curse of fly fishing. It's what usually sends so many anglers scampering away in search of their spinning rods. Well, there's no need to do that, because if we can spey cast properly from either shoulder, we can, as I shall show you later, defeat almost any conditions of wind and water. Now, before I go any further, I want to remind you always to tape up the joints of your rod. Spey casting rolls the rod and loosens these ferrules. As I know to my own cost, I've made all the mistakes myself. If you don't tape up your joints, then sooner or later your top joint's going to go sailing off into the river. Now, There are two methods of spey casting, the single spey and the double spey. Let's imagine that I'm standing on the left bank of a river, that's the left bank when facing downstream, so the current is flowing from my right down here to my left. And my fly has finished up down here at the end of my last cast. And I want to make a big change of casting angle to take the fly from downstream below me there and put it out over here. One method I can use is the single spey cast off the right shoulder, like this. And out goes the fly where I want it. Now the other cast I can use is to change shoulders and make it with my left hand the double spey cast, like this. And that goes out in the same position as before. And the cast I choose between the single or the double spey depends on the direction of the wind. With a strong upstream wind, we use the single spey. With a strong downstream wind, we use the double spey. Now I'll show you the reasons for this. Let's imagine that my fly is downstream at the end of the last cast, and that I have got a very strong upstream wind blowing. This is when I use the single spey, because spey casting depends on making a loop of line which I can punch out across the river. And with the upstream wind, that loop is held away from my rod upstream. If I attempted to do that with a strong downstream wind, that loop would be flattened back against my rod. It would make it impossible to cast. And that is why, when we have a strong downstream wind, we use the double spey, off the left shoulder this time. I draw the fly up a little way, make my loop downstream here, and the wind, you see, holds the loop away from the rod and allows me to punch the line out across the river. So you can see that the ability to cast off either shoulder is essential, because if we can defeat a strong upstream or downstream wind. This casting diagram may help you to remember which cast to use. From this we can see that with an upstream wind we fish the single spey cast, left-handed from the right bank, right-handed from the left bank. With a downstream wind we fish the double spey cast, right-handed from the right bank, left-handed from the left bank. So that, provided we can fish off either shoulder, we can defeat almost any conditions of wind and water. Just remember the mnemonic: downstream wind, double spey cast. Now I may as well point out here that the use of the left hand isn't essential. We can make all the casts we want as if off the left shoulder, but with our right hand. For example, here is the single spey cast, as if off the left shoulder, but made with the right hand. And here, the double spey, again, as if off the left shoulder, but made with the right hand. Not perhaps quite so elegant, but it works and it puts out a good line, and this can be very valuable. A few years ago I smashed up my left elbow. I couldn't use my arm. I could just support my rod at the base. And I had to devise a method of casting, so I did. I did all my casting off the right shoulder and it caught me salmon, so it can't be bad. And later I'll teach you how to make this cast. It is very simple. It only requires a little practice. Of course, spey casting isn't confined to a double-handed rod. We can spey cast perfectly well with a single-handed rod, and often have to. We can make single speys, double speys, roll casts perfectly well with a single-handed rod. Gets us out of lots of trouble when we've got a high bank or bushes behind us. No matter what species we're fishing for, no matter what water we're on. So you can see that whether we've got a big rod or a single-handed rod, spey casting really is essential. And incidentally, how useful it is to be able to roll cast and spey cast when we're loch fishing from a boat. It's so safe. The fly never comes anywhere near the boatman. The other occupant of the boat is never in danger of getting a fly in his ear. I can cast in any direction I like in perfect safety. So, how do we go about it? When learning to spey cast, we must start with the roll cast, because it's on the roll cast that both spey casts depend. This is because the forward stroke made with the roll cast is precisely the same as that used in both spey casts. Now, when we make a roll cast, we form a loop of line which we punch out across the water. As it unrolls, it picks up the leader and fly and carries them out with it. This is all that spey casting is, because spey casting is simply contrived roll casting. We contrive a loop of line which we punch out just in the same way that we do when we're roll casting. Like this. Now, it's vital to remember that this forward stroke is made with forearms and wrists only. We don't push the rod forward. We don't try and roll the line by coming over with our shoulder. That only dissipates power. Whichever shoulder we're casting from, it's only the forearms and wrists that are used, so that the rod is employed as a spring to punch the line out across the surface. It is just as though we were using a double-handed hammer to drive a spike into a wall. We don't push a hammer, nor do we push our rod. We bring the hammer back, very slightly break the wrists, and as we come forward, we snap the wrists over as the head of the hammer strikes the spike. This is exactly what we do with our rod when we come forward, like that. We snap the rod as though we were trying to snap it in half. Check it, and the line goes shooting forward. Like this. Right, now then, the position of the hands and feet is very important. I recommend the grip of the hands with the thumb on top of the rod, this hand the same, the arm not out at right angles, but fairly well down, in line with rod and shoulder. Feet, left or right foot forward according to the shoulder you're casting from. Casting from the left shoulder, left foot forward. Right shoulder, right foot forward. So as you rock back very slightly on the left foot, when you make your backstroke and take the weight of the body on your right leg under the shoulder you're casting from as you come forward. If you don't cast with the foot forward under the shoulder you're using, you'll very soon have a sore back. You'll find it very difficult to cast for long without getting pains in your back. If you cast like this, you can cast all day without fatigue, and this goes for all our casting. We start the roll cast with the line extended across the surface in front of us, and we start by drawing the line towards us across the surface, raising the rod as we do so to bring the reel level with the chin. At this point, the rod is just past the vertical at about 1 o'clock, and this is what I call the key position from which the forward stroke is made. And it's very, very important, because this is the position from which we make the forward stroke of both spey casts. So on your video, return to this position constantly. This is what I call the key to spey casting. The reel level with the chin, the rod just past the vertical. To make the forward stroke, all I have to do is to flex the rod, stopping it on the forward stroke at about 11 o'clock, so that the rod acts like a spring and punches the line out across the surface, like this. Now that stroke is made, as I say, only with the arms, forearms and wrist, not with the shoulder, not like that. You lose power, but like that. Keep the shoulders still. If we check too late, the line is driven down onto the surface. That we want to avoid. Since we want to avoid disturbance, we want that line to shoot out above the water. And in order to do that, we stop the rod at about 11 o'clock, at about this angle, and we're conscious of aiming the fly not at the point on the surface where we want it to go, but up, perhaps at the top of the distant trees. Again, like that. Now our ears are very useful to us when we're fly casting, because we tend to cast very much with our ears. Sound plays a very important part. Listen, for example, to the sound of a well-executed roll cast. Now this is a cast with insufficient power. Now if you hear that, you know that that cast isn't shooting out above the water as it should. It's falling rather in a heap and dribbling out across the surface. So, alive to the sound of the cast. Listen. That's the sound we want to hear. It's important to remember that when we start this cast, we don't drag the line off the surface. The start of the cast has no relationship whatever to the start of the overhead cast. If we make the mistake of dragging the line off the surface, like that, it bounces and helps to destroy our loop. That's what happens, and tends almost always to lead to a faulty executed forward stroke. Listen to this. Did you hear that nasty little flick? And again. That is a result of not drawing the line back smoothly across the surface, far enough towards us. Also, the result of trying to go forward too soon with insufficient line on the surface. it is essential in this cast, as in the spey casts, that sufficient line is kissing the surface before we make our forward stroke. It is failure to allow enough line to kiss the water immediately before we make the forward stroke that's responsible for so much bad roll casting. And apropos of that, it's worth remembering that when you're fishing from a high bank, as we often are, well above the water level, it's doubly important that we should be conscious of letting enough line touch the water before we go forward, because of course it's much easier when we're wading, and therefore much nearer to the water, for our line naturally to come back along the surface. Remember, if we're from a high bank, be conscious of letting enough line drop down on the water. And that is just as you reach the key position there. As you reach the key position, so the maximum amount of line should be kissing the water. This applies equally, as we shall see, to the two spey casts. Now, just now I talked about changing angle, and that if we wish to change angle, either we change feet and change shoulders, or let the line go on the other side of our body. But we can't change a big angle with a roll cast. That's why we use the two spey casts. There is, however, while I'm on the subject of change of angle, a tip I can give you when you're overhead casting. Now, there isn't going to be much overhead casting in this video for reasons I've already given you. But if you are making overhead casts, and sometimes it is necessary, especially when we're fishing very, very calm, very glassy water, when spey casting may be disruptive, and an overhead cast is better. There's a tip for making a big change of angle without false casting. Merely move your rod round into the direction you want the next cast to go, and come straight back and forward along there, and the line will shoot out straight as a spear. You've got to give it a little extra beef, however, in the back cast, because, of course, you've got this extra angle at which to drag the line off the water. So, it doesn't come off quite as easily as it does if you were to bring it straight back. Nevertheless, remember, a little extra beef in the back cast, straight forward again, and out goes your line, straight as you wish. Now, to go on to a much safer way of presenting a fly, the single spey cast. Now, I remind you that when we make our roll cast, we come up to the key position and punch the line out across there. When we make the single spey cast, we contrive to get into exactly the same position. I'm on the left bank of a river, my fly is downstream. In order to make the cast, I want to place the fly upstream of me, create a loop of line just as I do in the roll cast, and punch that fly out just as I have done with that roll cast. To do that, I place the fly upstream of me, a loop of line is automatically formed, and I punch that loop of line out across the surface as I did in the forward stroke of the roll cast. Now, to get that fly into just the position I want it, slightly upstream of the rod and to the right of my right shoulder, I make a figure of 8 with the rod. And this figure of 8 is very important indeed, because it's analogous to the golfer's swing. I make the same movement every time to bring the fly across exactly in the same place each time I want it. I'll do it again. take the rod slightly inshore, bring it up, down, fly across, loop of line is formed, the fly is punched out in the new direction. Notice that this figure of 8, like that, is the same each time. You can do it blindfolded. You can spey cast in pitch darkness. If only you learn to make that figure of 8 exactly the same each time. Now, we take the rod very slightly inshore when we start this cast. Then we raise it. Our arms extend straight out in front of us. We do not move the fly at this stage. All we do is to change the direction of the line, because where we point that rod, the line will follow. And when we want that fly to come upstream here, what we're doing is merely to give it the new direction that it's going to follow when we flick it upstream. And we make the upstream flick on the downward stroke like that. It's only a tiny flick of the wrists, just sufficient to bring the fly across. It's all done by the rod. Up it comes, across comes the fly, the loop is formed, and all we have to do is to punch the line out. Again, fly across, out. Now, we notice that when the fly comes across and pitches down just beyond our right shoulder, it gets there before I've completed the figure of 8. This is the angle at which my rod is when the fly strikes the water. But it's not yet ready, not yet in a position ready for me to go forward. I've still got to complete it, the movement, to bring it up to the key position. And that little additional movement from here to here is enough to time the forward stroke. If I don't do that, if I go forward too soon, this is what happens. If I anticipate the forwards, did you hear that? That nasty little crack, probably another fly gone, because I've started the forward stroke too soon. I didn't get the rod up into the key position after placing the fly in the water here. Why do we place the fly upstream of us? Simply because if we want to change direction from there to there, I have to get the fly above the rod, otherwise I'm crossing over. And if I cross over my line like that, invariably I'm going to get hung up. I'm never going to get away with it. So if by any chance, when making a single spey cast, you don't get the fly far enough upstream, don't attempt to go on with your cast, because if you cross the line you'll get hung up. Always go forward, downstream of wherever the fly pitched. Let the fly swing round, no harm is done, and start again. Now this figure of 8 is all important. Get the rhythm right. It's a very graceful movement. It's like drawing beautiful curves on cartridge paper with charcoal. Up, across, up to the key position and forward. Up, across, key position, forward. I'll talk you through it as I make the cast. Now, up, fly across, up, forward. That is the timing. Again, up, across, up, forward. It's one continuous movement. Notice, having got round to this position, we do not wait in this position. It's continuous movement. A lovely continuous curve. It's a very beautiful cast. And I must emphasize that there is no force required. It's a very gentle cast. It's only the snap, final snap of the wrists that punches the line out. Otherwise, it's very gentle and very graceful. It is the most beautiful cast to watch, the most beautiful cast to perform, and you'll enjoy your fishing so much. I'll tell you, whether you're catching fish or not, if you make some beautiful spey casts, you're really going to enjoy your fly fishing. Now, we see the importance of this figure of 8 and standardizing this figure of 8 when we come to casting off the other shoulder, as we shall have to do. And that is, if we're right-handed, well, sooner or later we've got to learn to cast off the left shoulder. Well, it's really very simple if you remember the exact formation of this figure of 8, because all we have to do is to describe the same figure of 8 with our left hand, and our fly will automatically go in the same place. Like this. It's the rod that does the work for us. I'll do it again. In, out, fly across, cast. It's so graceful and so easy. You're not conscious of working at it at all. It requires no force. If you get this rod movement right, the cast will make itself. Once more, in, across, out. Don't hurry the final stroke. Do get the rod up to the key position in one easy, graceful movement like this before you go forward. It's so simple and so easy. Now, talking of casting off the left shoulder brings me on to cack-handed casting, that is, casting off the right shoulder as though for the left shoulder, that I described earlier in the program. And I said I'd show you how to do it, because it can be very useful in times of emergency. Well, exactly the same thing applies. All we have to do is to remember our figure of 8. And this time I do it in reverse, like this. That's all I have to do. If I just remember this figure of 8 and do it on the wrong side of my body, give the cast plenty of time, don't hurry my forward stroke, get the fly into position. It's a beautiful cast. It's a very beautiful cast in its own right. And why more people don't use it, I cannot imagine, but I've never heard of anybody ever using this cast. And as I say, I once found it very, very useful when I smashed up my left arm. At any rate, it caught me some fish, and I hope one day it may catch you some too. Well, that brings us to the end of single spey casting. And I remind you, if there's anything you're in doubt about, any movement, well, run it over and over again on your video, because if you have mastered roll and single spey casting up to this point, you're going to find double spey casting absurdly simple. And it's double spey casting that we're going on to next. Now I want you to imagine that I'm standing on the right bank of the river, which is flowing from left to right down here. And that my fly is down here at the completion of my last cast, and I want to take it from there and put it out over there. Now, there's a very nasty, gusty wind blowing straight downstream, strong enough in its gusts to make overhead casting quite dangerous for a beginner, and for the single spey to be very difficult, owing to the strength of the wind blowing the line back against the rod, as I described earlier. I also told you earlier that when we have a strong downstream wind, we use the double spey cast. Well, this is an excellent opportunity to show it. Here it is. And you notice that there's no trouble in putting out a line, because when I make my downstream loop here, the wind is keeping this line well clear of the rod, and all I have to do is to punch it out, just as I did in the roll cast and the single spey, with the same forward stroke from the key position. And that's all the double spey is. Now, when we make it, we are drawing the fly towards us in order to gain enough line to make a loop here that I can roll out. Now, first of all, the grip. It's exactly the same as the grip we use for the roll cast and the single spey. Our feet, well, I've got my right leg forward because I'm casting off the right shoulder, and my foot is pointing in the direction I want my cast to go. Now, at the start of the cast, my fly is extended straight downstream. And incidentally, it's always a good plan to start by making a roll cast straight back downstream. It makes sure that everything is on the surface and you're nicely lined up to start the cast. Particularly is this so when you are double spey casting with a sinking line, as you will be in early spring and late autumn, so that it makes absolutely sure before you start the cast your line is right up on the surface. However, I make my roll cast downstream, then I go straight into the cast. I take the rod upstream with it held low, well out over the water, bring it back to make my loop and punch out the line. A point to watch. When you take the rod upstream, don't raise the rod too high. Otherwise it brings the line too close to your body, and you want to keep the line well clear. So don't raise it higher than the tops of the trees, shall we say, in this instance. It comes back like this, no further, that's quite enough to make a nice loop of line. Bring it back in the same plane, then up to the key position and punch it out. Now then, when we've got it up here and brought it back, raised it to the chin, ready to go forward, to make that forward stroke, how do we know exactly how to time that forward stroke? Here's a tip. I want you to watch the line on the surface as I bring the rod back. There's a little tiny riffle of spray. Now when that riffle stops, it means the maximum amount of line has been formed to make my loop that I'm going to punch out. So that, obviously, that is the time to start the forward stroke. one word of advice, and that is, although that ripple has stopped, make sure the rod is brought up to the chin, otherwise, again, you will mistime the forward stroke, because that gives you just the moment that you need to make sure sufficient line is on the water, as we had in the roll cast, to stop this nasty flick. Rhythm and timing are all important. You can think of it, if you like, as being in waltz time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, wham. But do remember to leave that space between the second 1, 2, 3 and the wham, because it's very more important. As you come back after the ripple, that line must touch the surface here. If you avoid that and make your forward stroke too soon, this is what it will look like, and this is what it will sound like. The cast collapses in a heap. There's a nasty little flick as you hear that snap in the air, and if you're not very lucky, you've lost your fly. Remember, don't hurry it. There's no hurry. You can take it as leisurely as you like. It's a very beautiful cast. It's the most important of all fly casts. If you just relax, the rod will do it all. There's no force required, but timing is all important. Up, ripple stops, rod up, reel to the chin, and forward. Nothing could be easier than that. So often this cast has been denigrated in the press by people seemingly who know nothing about spey casting, who call it just a fancy cast, a cast of no practical importance. In fact, of all fly casting, this cast is the most important. It'll get you out of more trouble in poor weather than any other. Of course, like our other casts, we must be able to do it from the other shoulder. In this case, we put our left foot forward, as before, bring our rod upstream here, make our loop, and out it goes. And just as I described with a single spey, we can do that as off the left shoulder, but off the right, like this. There you are. That is the cack-handed double spey cast. Now, I've already stressed the importance of keeping the rod low when you move it up and back. Also, the importance of timing the forward stroke after the ripple stops so that you have plenty of line on the water before you go forward. But there is one other fault which I must mention, and that is that when you bring the fly upstream, you just bring it along the surface. You don't drag it upstream like that, because if you do, it's very easy to bring it up too far. Remember, you must leave the fly well below the direction you want to make your forward stroke. Otherwise, you'll cross over the line and get fouled up every time, like this. If the line comes up too far, and I carry on with my cast, that's what happens, and my line gets fouled. And don't think you'll ever get away with it, because you won't. And finally, as with other casts, don't forget that we must bring our rod up to the key position for making our forward stroke. And when we do make our forward stroke, we aim it well up, not down on the water. Spey casting is so beautiful, so graceful, I can't overstress the importance of rhythm. Whichever cast you're making, roll cast, single, double spey, it's such a graceful, such a beautiful cast. You get such joy from performing it well. Watch the grace of the moving line. Now, I've shown you the importance of the roll cast in relation to the single spey and the double spey cast. And I urge you that if you want to be a good spey caster, perfect your roll casting first. Practice, practice, practice. And if you're in any doubt, run your video over and over again and pick up all the points I've made. You won't get it all first time through. But if you can only learn to spey cast, I promise you you'll enjoy your fly fishing 100% more. And you'll reap the reward when you get to the river. And it's to the river that I'm going now.